Well, Hector, welcome to the podcast. Obviously, been involved in security for quite some time. A whole variety of things that we could end up chatting about. But I'm stoked. Appreciate you making the time to join us, man.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to be here with you and chop it up. Hopefully, we have some great conversations to be had. Those are always fun for me, so I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely, man. I know there's plenty of folks that might know about you from previous things with LulzSec or under the moniker Sabu, but maybe kind of near and dear to my heart as somebody that I got my own start. Waking up to the FBI one day as a kind of wake up call to change what I was doing from a security, hacking, etc. perspective. I'm just curious, like how did you get involved in kind of learning about security, hacking, all this stuff in the first place, man? What was your entrance into it all?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's a good question. I started by accident. I was a kid from the projects here in New York City, and computers weren't really a thing for me growing up. I mean, I've had run-ins here and there. Had an old Apple way back in the days, but getting on the internet was definitely interesting for me because I spent a lot of my time watching films. So I saw all the hacker films you could imagine up to that point, up to the mid-90s.
I gotta ask, do you have any favorite? I know it's like a loaded question because it's like whatever your favorite, the internet will always judge. So but
they'll judge you no matter what.
I personally don't mind watching Hackers as a movie. I thought it was fun, but I also got some love for Sneakers and some of the classics. But
yeah, no, there was some great films, right? So Sneakers is a classic, and the Hackers is cool. I like to have fun with it. There was a point when you would say, "Yeah, I love Hackers," that you automatically got labeled like a script kiddie or whatever, or a farce or a charlatan or whatever. And then if you mentioned, well, I watched The Net in '96. Oh, okay, that's a little bit better, right on the malware research and development front. But no, I think what inspired me was War Games. And I know it's a little older, 1983.
Yep.
But it was a good film because it taught you some things that are relevant today. I learned about like reverse tunneling, reverse shells through War Games, right? The scene where Matthew Broderick gets kicked out of Whopper or Joshua, right? And NORAD puts up they basically put a blocker up, a firewall, what have you, that he couldn't call back into the system. But he did gain access to the system. Remember when Whopper called him back? It was a reverse tunnel, right? It was a
never. That's so funny. I've never thought of it that way, but that makes total sense.
I mean, I like that. It is what it is, right? So even today,
it is what it is.
Yeah, with so many networks now, they're natted. You can't just open up a bind shell and just connect back to the host on an IP and a port, rather.
Yeah.
Because in most cases, a lot of cloud environments today automatically disallow a lot of incoming traffic. Even creating a new AWS instance, you have to specify HTTP and HTTPS traffic. So anyways, the War Games did it for me. It really intrigued me. I wanted to learn about word dialing because obviously Matthew Broderick was doing that in the film, right? That's how he started off, word dialing systems. But it wasn't until like 95, 6 when I lost my family. They went to prison. I was kind of home, depressed. I was in the streets for a couple of months. And then coming back home, I had access to a computer that my aunt left me before she went to prison. I got on the internet thanks to those AOL free trial CDs. Got on AOL in 95, late 95. Got online, and it's like I tell young folks now, the internet back then was the Wild West, including AOL. It was really bizarre seeing.
I'm horrible with timelines, but is that like when AOL and all that stuff was around?
Exactly right.
Okay.
You had AOL 95, right?
Yep.
And back then, cyber had a different definition than it does today, but we don't have to go into that. I'm not sure you know what I mean.
I don't know. I kind of want you to go ahead and what's unless it's
well, it's not PG-13 if your audience is
yeah. Never mind. Sorry, I got you.
So cyber had
that took me a second.
Cyber had a different definition back then, and
fair. We'll keep going.
Yeah. So, but anyways, from AOL to IRC, that transition was huge for me. And getting on IRC was even more chaotic. Kind of reading stuff that you would find in the Where's channels, for those that don't know, whereas back then was, where you went to go download pirated software. Now you probably use BitTorrent or just buy it outright. But back then, cracking shareware was all the rage. So downloading stuff, randomly finding a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook with a version of the Hacker's Manifesto inside,
Yep.
So I started reading all this stuff, and then I started looking for more, and here I am.
What got you down? Like you were mentioning, you had this computer that you were able to get access to. Like, I always find it interesting. Like, I think for myself, right? It was like, getting in the hacking as a teenager was like, I had my own kind of version of like chaotic home life. Sounds like you were going through quite some things.
Absolutely.
And, maybe I'm understating that. Right. But yeah, there was something for me about like getting a computer. It kind of like opened me to this whole world that I could kind of like, learn, explore, but also kind of giving me some sense of control back in my life, where I felt like as a kid going through some of the stuff that was going on, didn't feel like there was a lot of control happening. And like, here's this world that I could like learn to kind of command it and control it. I just, versus like, I don't know, there's plenty of people that, might have had that going on and picked up a guitar and dove into that as a thing, like what kind of got you like, why'd you find that like an exciting place to be inhabiting and kind of learning and stuff?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I don't get that often. Honestly, it was my escape, it was a good escape for me. It allowed me to just not think about the things I didn't want to think about, and, not have to deal with depression, not have to deal with sadness and loss, right. And abandonments. And so it allowed me to kind of create a persona, which ultimately, my first persona was Buddha the hacker, or whatever that was. But then, I ended up switching up to Sabu and created a personality. He was much more aggressive and much more proactive in learning, So I was trying to create a better version of myself, and ultimately became radicalized along the way, because the Sabu persona became a very bad guy. That's for sure.
Gotcha. There's always, if you want to share or not, there's always like stories to how people pick different nicknames. Like, how'd you end up picking that as a thing? If you want to share.
Yeah. I think in those days, picking a pseudonym or a handle, which is what we called it back then.
Yeah.
It was a very important part of your life. It was kind of like, becoming a man or growing up or whatever the hell it was, right?
Yeah. It was a big deal getting the right handle, man.
It was a big deal. So when I went with Buddha, it's because in the streets, they always call me Bull. So I was like, all right, cool. I'm chunky and fat, so I guess I could be the Buddha. And I ran into another hacker who also had Buddha. He changed his name to Shot, and I changed my name to Sabu after we came to agreement. And then Sabu I got from watching wrestling. Late nights, 2, 3 in the morning. We used to have something called ECW.
Okay.
Extreme Championship Wrestling. And there was a wrestler by the name of Sabu who was extreme. He had scars all over his body. He would jump off of third story, stages. And he was quiet. He didn't speak. That was his gimmick, right? Quiet guy, doesn't speak. Hardcore, right? So again, it kind of matched my persona more than this peaceful, deity. So Sabu worked out best.
Gotcha, man. And so where did it go from there for you? Did you have like any part of, you mentioned like war dialing? Was there other kind of things that you found kind of interest in, like from there was like phone freaking going on, war dialing, different forms of hacking and everything else? Was there like any kind of specific area technically that you were kind of first most interested in? Like I find some people maybe got into like cracking and maybe things progressed from there. I had a lot of fun as a teenager doing I was trying to remember, man, there was a war dialer I was using for Windows back in the day that I might have to Google while we're chatting, but definitely trying to relive some of my war games kind of experience there. But like, yeah, was there a certain area that you kind of got more or less interested in from a kind of security hacking perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, because I did have to go through stages. I had to kind of figure out what it is that I wanted to learn or do. It's like I tell cybersecurity students today, right? Cybersecurity is extremely broad. You know, you could be a SOC analyst, you go into threat intel, you could be a exploit DevOps sec, right? So I kind of went through that same struggle, um, and there's some factors here, right? So yes, freaking was a thing back then, but by the time I came online, I was online here in New York City. All of our phone systems had already moved from analog to digital. So a lot of the freaking boxes that you were reading about, the yellow boxes, and rainbow boxes, and blue boxes, most of them were ineffective against the digital system. So even though I followed the material, I was very interested. I wanted to learn how to build some of that stuff. The timing wasn't right. I came online at the wrong time, right? And I think 9X upgraded, like 91. So I was 4 years late anyway,
No, that's super interesting, because it was similar when I was first learning about freaking. It was like internet becoming a thing. A lot of that stuff was on its way out. I'm gonna see if I can remember it, but I was lucky in my area. I was able to get a tour of a central office that had everything had switched to digital, but there was one central office that still had like I think it was a 1AE switch, which was like one of the last analog ones in our area, and like going inside the central office, which maybe for listener folks that aren't familiar, but basically all your physical landlines terminate to like a central office or relay, I should say. What was amazing is going into one of these switches, which is switching all the different phone calls, connecting everything, and you could literally hear the clicks of individual calls being connected and stuff, which was crazy. But like I feel like I kind of, there was like this era of that sort of hacking, phone freaking, war dialing that I came as it was ending. And I kind of wish, I don't know, it reminded me of what you were describing there, that it sounds like similar for you on the like coming at the tail end of it and the timing. And so I'd assume the bigger focus became kind of like, things related, internet, and that form of kind of hacking in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I mean, that was my position, right? I got on at the wrong time. The BBS era was kind of starting to phase out, but it was still kind of there. So I needed to kind of figure out my direction. And back then, they used to make a distinction. I'm not sure you remember this, but there was a distinction between hacker and cracker, right? Those, right? And not just cracking software, but cracking into systems, right? That was a distinction back then. So I kind of figured, hey, you know what? Maybe I'll be a cracker. I need to figure out, how it's actually done. So I spent some time on IRC with just idling in the Frozen Crew channel. Shout out to them. Those guys, I think they're still around to this day. And kind of reading the tutorials on how to break shareware and patching binaries using a disassembler and hex editor and all this cool stuff. All that stuff was fantastic, but what really changed my perspective was finding several documentations on CGI security. That was really interesting. Used to have a guy back then in like the mid 90s called Xenomorph. I think he may even still be here in the industry. He might be a professional in a suit. But he put together some really cool articles on CGI exploitation, which helped. But what really changed my direction was the Cult of Dead Cow with their and I know a lot of people claim this. So I'm about to say might be controversial. A lot of people claim that they created Hacktivism, but my first introduction to Hacktivism was Cult of Dead Cow. That must have been 96, 97, whatever it was. I forgot the exact time. So that was the inspiration for me. And then finally, just to conclude your question here, it's a good question. I read a book called, I read a book about the war between the Masters of Deception and the Legion of Doom. You remember the book that came out? It came out like in 92, I think.
Oh God, you're stretching my memory. Yes, I know the book, and I'm completely spacing on it.
It's a classic.
Yeah.
I think it's called Masters of Deception, the gang that ruled cyberspace, right? That should be it. It was a red cover. It came out in 1995, actually. I thought it came out earlier. but yeah, I went to Barnes and Noble. I picked up a copy, and I read about it. And there was a person in there that changed my life.
Okay.
All right, and it might be cliche because everybody always points to this one guy, but to me, it was reading about fiber optic, aka Marc.
Yep.
He's like a professional in the industry. You know, he's a CTO or CEO somewhere. He's doing very well with his life. But reading about his skill set and what he did, I pretty much said to myself, yeah, I want to be like that. So he was kind of known as like the Unix master, right? He got around Unix systems. That was kind of like his thing. And so I said to myself, I want to be that Unix guy too. So big shout out to him. He was an inspiration for me.
That's awesome.
And
man.
I started reading about Unix and Linux and very early on.
That is cool. And I find a lot of folks, like I said, maybe got started back then in that way. It's like a big inspiration. And I'm gonna space on the book, but like a huge inspiration for me back then was Kevin Poulsen. I don't know if that rings a bell. He never played it up much after. You know, there's obviously other folks that became kind of more famous post, but like just reading about all the things that he had done and everything else as a teen at the time was a crazy thing. And then definitely to your point, man, the MOD, LOD, etc. was that was some goods, especially as a teenager. Just
Absolutely.
like, man, yeah, that is cool. Yeah. So how did things progress for you from then? So it sounds like kind of the Unix Linux world was kind of that next thing you got interested in. I always liked the joke that I was like so frustrated trying to get my modem driver compiled on Linux. That's why I got in a lot of the Windows hacking early on by accident. But so how did things evolve for you from that point where you started to kind of settle on this kind of area that you had more interest in?
Yeah, well, I kind of YOLO'd it, and I downloaded Slackware on a floppy disk. And then I ran into the problem that a lot of those computers at that time were sold with Win modems, or what they call Win modems. So I couldn't make any dial out connections. I couldn't get back online. So I spent a whole summer going through it. And big shout out to the Slackware people, because they included in their installation the Linux how-to pages. And in there was an absolute wealth of knowledge on everything from what is Linux to kernel, what is the API programming, every possible thing not related to Linux was in there, including which kind of modems you could use to connect online. So I went to my school, and I offered to do tech IT support and services, and part of that included recycling old computers. And in one of those recycled computers, I found an old 14.4K AT&T modem. Grabbed that. I dropped my Windows modem there, my Win modem. Went home and I got connected, man. I was happy as hell.
That's the. It's definitely one of those things. Obviously, I think every generation takes different stuff for granted. But obviously, right now, the amount of power of what's sitting there that you can access on the internet and everything else. I mean, it was the craziest experience in the world back then. Getting online for the first time. Like what did you end up? Like once you were kind of online in that way, was it just trying to, sponge up even more, trying to find more in the kind of, hacking and related scene and Zines and everything else? Or
well, aside from like learning Linux, and then eventually the BSD. So I was on BSD for a long time after that. Shout out to Slackware, it got me started. But I spent the next 10 years of my life on NetBSD or FreeBSD, interchangeable. NetBSD, because all my computers were broken down and old. So I was poor. So if I would find a computer in the street, I could just throw NetBSD on it. A full, complete operating system installation with X at 80 megabytes. Mark, 80 megabytes, brother.
I don't think, do people even use megabytes anymore? I think everything's now just because.
Let me tell you something. NetBSD changed my life. It gave me hope. Now I'm online. I go straight to IRC. I want to be, the next iteration of fiber optics. So I have to learn Unix. Unfortunately, the Unixes of the world were very expensive still at the time, right? They were all commercial. I don't think a lot of people realize this. A lot of the Unix systems out there were commercial. those licenses were 50, 60 grand per system or some ridiculous licenses. I was not getting access to that, Mark. So in order for me to learn to hack, I had a hack to learn. Shout out to my boy Brute Logic on Twitter that he's been using that phrase for a long time. And so in order for me to break into a Solaris server, I had to look at potential vectors to break into Solaris server, or SunOS back then for the old beards in the crowd. So I read this really cool paper on CGI security, showing you how to exploit a default Apache script, which is PHF. It was a file read vulnerability. I think at some point every hacker from that era must have used PHF. I found a server in Japan that was vulnerable to it. I was able to read the etc password file. The server had Telnet on it. I downloaded John the Ripper. Shout out to Solar Designer for John the Ripper. Downloaded that.
Another huge legend in the field.
Another huge legend, absolutely. God bless him.
Yeah.
And so I cracked the hash. I connected over Telnet. One of the documents I found online was how to hack into systems using Telnet. The ins and outs of Telnet, right? Log into server on Telnet, and here I am, this teenager from the middle of the projects, staring into a SunOS terminal. And I'm like, okay, what's next? So now I'm looking, and mind you, we didn't have search engines like that. I think Google was just coming out in 96, I think, or 98.
That was like Alta Vista days or some, or what.
We had Alta Vista. And so I go on Alta Vista and I start looking for SunOS exploits, SunOS local exploits. I found my way, became admin, and guess what? Started patching the systems, running it, and that server lasted me like 9 years. It was online that long. And so almost accidentally, I didn't become a hacker. I became more of a systems administrator. That's the funny part.
Well, tell me this. We used to always joke back in the day where, there was always this thing. I don't know if you ended up doing this much, but like sometimes you'd get into the system and, definitely, I think we probably had some similar time periods, but for me, like, you wanted to go learn about, Sun or some other type of system. And you probably did that by like hacking into the system at the local university or whatever else. Like, it's not like today where now you can do a whole CTF lab online, setup for you, et cetera. Right. Like, I always thought it was interesting of a lot of times, getting into a system like that, and you would end up like fixing the thing that got you in, maintain and also, in my case as a teen, selfishly, like, I didn't want some other hacker to get in the same way or whatever, but one less vuln at the end of the day.
Well, do you remember At Stake? Remember when Love Industries and At Stake, you had all those guys, right?
Yeah.
I remember there was a joke that came out of that era. I think it was Dave Attell that said the joke. The joke was along the lines of, well, do you know how you can tell that hackers are broken into your systems? And the answer is, the question is like, well, how? Because they're running properly. They're properly maintained, right? Because back then, I'm not sure the audience knows, especially if you're in a younger crowd, right? Back then, stability was a major issue. You remember that? You had kernel,
huge, yeah.
You had blue screens of death all the time. You had all sorts of issues for all of the operating systems. Maybe with the exception of SunOS, because that was based off like Unix V7 or whatever. It had an old code base already by then. So it was more mature. But for like a Windows server, a Windows network, you always had crashes. You always had so many issues. So the fact that your network is running smooth was an indicator that you're either very lucky or hackers are broken in and they're taking care of your systems.
No, that's fair. That's what made me think of it when you're talking in terms of like, it's really like you end up administering the system, right? That was definitely the joke of it for sure. It's obviously like an interesting thing, like the progression. Like I was kind of talking to you before we started. I think there's been, million and one news stories, stuff in books. I mean, all sorts of things that's, covered you and LulzSec and everything in between. And so wasn't for me trying to rehash some of that today because I think it's kind of well documented, but when you think of that kind of time and kind of what you were inhabiting, like I don't know, what's your kind of like big takeaways like now, like looking back on any of that, like if there was a chance to say things that you maybe haven't kind of said in relation to that stuff in the past, like anything that you'd want to share. And I will put out here for those listening to this episode today, we're touching on a lot of stuff that I'm not like really like explaining in some detail. Like we mentioned stuff like the Hackers Manifesto. I'm just going to consider this an episode that like you're going to want to listen to while you got Google open.
That's right.
Because there's a bunch of things being referenced here, a bunch of people, stuff like Masters of Deception. There's just a whole bunch of rabbit holes you can go down that like we don't have time to get into today.
No.
But like you've obviously told that story and in your time related to that, but yeah, just curious, anything that would come to mind that you would want to share.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. In many ways, that era was documented. Unfortunately, it was documented by the wrong people. A lot of people kind of made things up or did misattributions. I felt like there was a lot of folks from that era, mostly journalists, that kind of had their own agendas. Maybe trying to sell a movie option or something, trying to dramatize certain things in my story. And I spent when I came out of prison and I was unbanned off the internet because I had to deal with that for a while. I spent a lot of time trying to debunk some of that stuff, and eventually, one day it was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna go on my life. I'm not gonna try to debate strangers at this point on my own story. My story is my story. It is what it is. I think that the biggest takeaway for me, if anybody's ever interested in that whole era, that 2010 to 2012, it was just 2 to 3 solid years of just hacktivism work that a lot of us did. And that is that I didn't realize how left we had gone. In fact, I'm teaching a course with a good friend of mine on cyber terrorism, and just kind of listening to other hacktivist stories, and then here, kind of sitting down and reflecting. In many ways, I'm like, damn, I became so radicalized along the way. What I thought initially was fun, or what I thought we were helping people. In many cases, I was probably making things worse, right? So I've had people try to approach me like, oh my God, are you like proud? Like you did all this cool stuff with like the Arab Spring, for example, or the whole HB Gary thing exposed like government surveillance and spying and all this stuff. And I'm like, with the exception of HB Gary, which is a whole conversation for another day, the Arab Spring and all that, and those people suffered. The Tunisians, especially the Libyans, are still suffering. The Syrians, the Egyptians suffered after their revolution. I'm not too proud of my engagement or involvement. That's not how I started hacktivism. My first hacktivist operation, in case you guys are curious, was against the government of the United States, specifically the United States Navy and the Puerto Rican government. This was in the year 2000. And I was like the first Puerto Rican hacker, that's my background, first Puerto Rican hacker on a Puerto Rican political issue. And I addressed that issue in my own way with the defacements, which, back then it was the thing, but also breaking into these servers and kind of causing a stir. And my focus was to bring focus to the problem. That was hacktivism, but coordinating with a bunch of people that had all these crazy ideas, some of which turned out to be like supremacists of certain races. Some of these people turned out to be part of the intelligence community. So I was literally working with people that had agendas when all I wanted to do was help people. Their agendas was anti that. So I think my takeaway from that whole era is that it wasn't what it seems. And now that I'm older, I'm much more wiser, Mark. I promise you that. I've come to realize that that wasn't hacktivism. That was something else. So
yeah, man. No, it's an interesting thing. I think about that stuff a lot, just in like my own time of. It's kind of a crazy thing, right? Like you can be, and even still now, man, like you can be a teenager right now, and you can acquire this crazy skill set if you really like dive into it to have a lot of effect in the world. And it's, I think there's a lot of things in life where like maybe you can't you can't kind of get to the point of maybe affecting things until you've kind of like, lived enough and you kind of got wiser in some sense. But like, it's a crazy thing in like hacking and security. Like you can really like acquire kind of a tool set and an understanding to affect the world kind of maybe beyond where you're, the maturity of thoughts and ideas and the experience are there. Right. And it's like, I always think of the, the fact, like we were saying earlier, where, I think today there's a lot of different avenues, particularly, if you're just trying to learn more of this, there's all sorts of you can do every type of like online CTF testing, this, that, and the other, right? Like, in a way that, I always joke, I'm like, didn't have virtualization back in the day, right? Like wasn't doing a home lab or whatever. How do you think about like, if you think about the kind of timeless parts of security, right? Where obviously like, the ways that you were describing maybe back at the early start, like, Telnet and other things that you were doing. And, obviously there's always new types of vulnerabilities, new types of risk, like anything that you would kind of compare and contrast of the kind of, now versus then. In some sense, it's all just techniques and staying up with them, both defensively and offensively. But I'm just curious, anything that kind of, how you think some of that stuff's evolved over time?
Well, I think the methodology has evolved substantially, right? What made me effective as a black hat, as an adversary, right? Was the fact that I had figured out early on to develop a structure, methodology. Maybe it was out of laziness. Maybe it was the fact that I kept doing the same thing over and over. I did probably hundreds of thousands of hacks in my life. So doing the same things over and over was a drain for me eventually. So let's chalk it up to laziness, or maybe let's just say that I want to be more effective. Whichever direction you want to go with, I'm okay with. So creating a methodology for me as a bad actor, being 13, 14 years old, a little bit older, really changed my perspective on targeting and prioritization. And I think a lot of bad actors are doing that now, right? I also think that a lot of the problems that we dealt with back then are very similar, or maybe even the same problems that we have today. We still have the password problem, right? Okay, instead of breaking into a corporate network using Telnet, okay, now you're using SSL VPN. I mean, look at the news today with Avanti, 0 days every other day, every other week. Before that, it was Pulse VPN. And before that, it was, another vendor, right? A lot of the similar problems. I mean, the fact that I'm doing, X amount of big internal red teams every year for corporate organizations, some in the Fortune 500, some in the Fortune 50. And some of these networks are still rocking to this day in 2024. And I'm not admonishing my clients. Don't get it wrong. Don't get it twisted. But because of various different reasons, they still may be operating out of flat corporate networks. Okay? And it could be that they've been running a legacy environment for the last 30 years. It could be that because of a previous ransomware campaign from 4 years ago, they had to put together a quick environment, right? A lot of the same problems from back then are still prevalent today. And I'm very happy that organizations like Google and Microsoft, started pushing out passkeys. I'm happy to hear that Microsoft, they're dealing with their own breaches. They're talking about removing, SMB 2.0 and below, or enforcing SMB signing, which is really good for internal network, or by default disabling IPv6 on an internal network that would open you up to like a broadcast attack or relay attack. So it's good to see that Microsoft and these vendors are making some changes. They're trying to improve the overall security posture of these organizations. But yeah, I would say we're still dealing with the same kind of problems. The only difference now is that we actually have decent security tools. Okay. And I hope you agree with me on that, because back then what you had was a lot of appliances. If you wanted to buy a security product, what did you have to do, Marc? You have to call the company, plug in the appliance. Right, that was the big thing in cybersecurity. So you had companies with warehouses full of appliances, and most of it was snake oil. This is why a lot of companies also didn't take cybersecurity serious, because they already got burns, by burning their budget on a product that doesn't even work, or investing in a big appliance that revolved around Snort, for example. I love Snort, but Snort's a signature-based system. a polymorphic payload is going to completely just fly right past snort or similar, right? Depending on your signature rules. So a lot of companies will burn, and we still are dealing with the aftermath of that. Now, I'm sorry, I'm on a bit of a rant, Mark. This is actually a very good question.
All good, man. All good.
Another, and several factors over the last, let's say, 2 years, 24 months, have started to kind of push organizations into taking their security seriously, which I'm happy about. You have the guy, the CISO that was charged by the U.S. government recently, right? You have the SEC requiring data breach notifications within 4 days of identification. You have CISA. Big shout out to people at CISA, right? Jen and her team, everybody else, right? They're pushing the CISA Kev, which is fantastic. And they're also training and providing services to smaller companies and organizations and agencies. So we have a lot of cool things now, especially in the tool side. The problem that you're going to have is now implementation, okay? And I'll give you guys a good example. You have a customer, they're like, hey, we want the best of the best, so we're going to pay for CrowdStrike Falcon, one of the best products I think is out there. When you CrowdStrike Falcon and pay X amount of dollars, it's expensive, right? But then they implement, they deploy, they're not making any changes to the endpoints, they're not utilizing sysconfig, they're not tightening controls in the CrowdStrike beacons, or CrowdStrike beacons, the sensors. I was thinking about Cobalt Strike, sorry. They're not investing time into further tightening these tools. For example, a company that brings in Proofpoint or Mimecast, 2 great email security tools, default installations, right? Or out of inconvenience or lack of convenience, they'll disable like that external tag that shows up when an email comes in from not your domain, right? They'll disable that or leave that out. These are all things that you need to utilize to further improve your security posture. And a lot of organizations are just purchasing, deploying, and setting it and forget it. I think you're my age, right?
Totally agree, man. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a problem. I think it's like definitely to your point. There's still a lot of companies that like it's hoping that there's the one product silver bullet versus like it's just a tool, right? It's a tool to tailor to your environment. And one of the things whenever I'm kind of like interviewing or been in positions of like hiring security folks, and I always kind of ask them, at the end of the day. You can look at all the different kind of headline breaches, and these companies own all the same kind of 10 security products that you're supposed to own, and yet they're still breached, right? And a lot of that comes down to just like your ability to tailor these things to your environment, right? And I think, what was it, was it Rob over at the NSA at it was a conference years back where he was mentioning about, at the end of the day, attackers knowing your environment better than you, right? Oh man, I'm totally butchering. I think it was at the Enigma conference. But yeah, I think a lot of times that's true, right? And so there's kind of a diminishing returns at some point, right? Of what are these things that you have? What have you actually tailored to your environment or not, right? Versus the set it and kind of forget it. And maybe kind of on that note, because you were mentioning some of the consulting and stuff, but in the most generic sense, dude, what are you up to now, right? Like again, I think people can read up all sorts of history and fun stuff on LulzSec and all the things that you've kind of been through, and I appreciate you sharing kind of your looking back kind of perspective on it and stuff. But yeah, what are you up to now?
Yeah, well, if you see my face, you see I'm kind of tired, I'm sleepy, half awake. The reality is that I'm super busy these days, which I'm very happy about. I'm the kind of person that if I'm idle, I become apathetic. I start going to who knows what direction. So these days, I'm just super busy. So on a day-to-day, I am doing internal assessments, red team, cyber risk services, penetration testing, threat modeling, stuff like that. So that pays the bills, right? That keeps me going. I do a lot of mentoring. So I have a set number of students I try to do like every year or every other quarter. Try to keep it around 6 because I don't want to disappoint anybody and not give them enough time. I'm teaching a course with my good friend Sam Curry on cyber terrorism for a university. He's kind of setting me up to go down the path of being like an adjunct professor. So I'm pretty happy about that. Have the podcast Hacker in the Fed. That's was popping for a minute. We had to take a break recently. The holidays, we just had to fall back, spend time with our families. But Hacker in the Fed, conversations just like this, talk about cybersecurity and so on.
And what's some of the stuff like when you're kind of mentoring some of the folks, like, or kind of any, advice? There's the version potentially of yourself or something, or myself back as a teen or whatever, right? Like, I know it's the kind of obvious question to ask, but like, what would you kind of say to any, young people that are kind of like starting to get interested in security, in hacking? I mean, just as you said, there's all these movies and a whole variety of things, and we talked a lot about the classics that kind of influenced us. I think there's a lot of modern takes, right? Maybe it's that kid now who's sitting there watching, Mr. Robot, right? And that's their inspiration. They're like, I want to do that, right? What's some kind of parting thoughts that you would kind of, share with those folks of, maybe how to think about things going forward?
Yeah, well, here's what I would think. So, as I told you guys in my story, I went through a pretty terrible time in my childhood, and I used the internet and the hacking as my escape. And I'm sure that some of you are going through pretty rough times, but you don't have to follow my footsteps for that same escape. You can really do a deep dive into building out your career. Cybersecurity is still very young, even though it's less than 20 odd years, but as an industry, it's extremely young. It's not going anywhere. And so what you have is an opportunity to build out a career in something you potentially like. You're going to have some fun with. You can meet some really fun people, okay? And do great things for your family. I'm very big on family, and I hope that some of you are as well. And so think about it like this. Once you get through this initial phase of learning, going to school, maybe doing some CTFs online, try hackme.com, hacker1.com, now you're doing bug bounties, you start to make some money, you're feeling pretty good about yourself, right? Now you can start to look at potential problems in the industry, or potential problems that most customers are dealing with, and you go in that direction. You want to be a SOC analyst, you can do that. You want to go into being a manager, there's so many different paths into the cybersecurity industry. And if you come from a poor environment like I was, so if you're a poor guy, poor lady, and you want to change your family's life, here's what you can do. Pick the direction you're going to take, follow that journey, study. Everything is almost free for this stuff, right? If you want to do your CCNA, go online. There's a ton of free resources on it. Use Security Plus, by all means. So many free resources. Depending on the time of year, you can probably get the certification for free as well, okay? Or you go through, I'm in New York City. There's a ton of New York City nonprofits that'll pay for your certification or give you a voucher. I'm sure in other states and other cities as well, okay? Now, once you get past that point, hopefully you get a nice entry-level internship. It's going to pay you the minimum, right? But once you spend about 6 months to a year there, hopefully you get an entry-level job. And now you went from making zero to making 40 to 60,000, depending on your state, depending on what city. Now, if you spend another 2 years at the job and you keep climbing, now you went from 40 to 60 up to 80 to 100, depending, again, on where you're at and depending on what career path you've taken. Almost instantly, you've changed the economic situation for your family, and now you're motivated. Now you have a lot of good things happening. And so hacktivism and hacking and scamming and cool IG, Instagram usernames, none of that is worth it. None of that means anything. Online brownie points doesn't mean anything. Let me tell you something, Marc, to kind of wrap up my thoughts here. When I was in prison, they put me in MCC. I was in 7 North, and I was hanging out with murderers and serial killers and cartel members, and they were all very nice, by the way. Very nice people. It's crazy how outside they seem so scary, but on the inside, they're friendly. And so, I have no idea how many times they would ask me, hey, Hector, so what are you in here for? They just told me they killed 9 people, or they were involved in the selling of 400 pounds of marijuana in a 2-week stretch, or whatever their story was. Oh, yeah, I'm here for computer hacking. You know how much of a dork I felt like, Marc? I'm not even joking, bro. I felt like such a dork because our crimes didn't even match, and I'm still in there with them because I had a high classification for my kids. Don't follow that path. Learn from me.
Gotcha, man. Gotcha. Well put, dude. I'm sure there's more we could chat there. That sounds intense and a bit crazy. Yeah, it's a crazy thing to think of the kind of progression of the industry from when there kind of was none to you're just kind of exploring and all the through lines of this stuff. And I appreciate you sharing a lot of that. Totally random, and we'll see if anything comes to mind. But do you have, I think of the progression of, when I was first starting out, like, you joked earlier at the beginning of, certain movie references, and it's like, you're a script kiddie if you liked it, but at the end of the day, everybody was a script kiddie at one point, like having to learn. And I always remember one of my favorite exploits back in the day was for the RPC Stat D service. I think if it was like the ADM folks or whoever had done that. This is where my memory's not serving me well. Maybe no offhand. Although I think there was a few of them. So to be fair,
Well, ADM and Woogle and all those guys released some crazy exploits, and then you also had LSDPL, the last stage of delirium out of Poland. Those guys released crazy exploits. Now that RPC Stat D exploit was very popular. I went a different direction.
Okay,
same era, different direction. My exploit of choice was the bind DNS exploit. Oh man, I got into so much with that exploit.
Fair. That would have been in the top 5 for me for sure. Yeah. Crazy, man. Crazy. Dude, I know we just touched a lot of things. Anything else that you want to share or put out while we're on, man? I think there's a million other directions we could go, but maybe for a part 2 sometime.
We definitely got to do a part 2. My only question for you is, where's Alice?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, there's an Alice and Bob. I hope I'm not Alice.
Yeah, man. No, not in this case. In this case, absent. I actually just... it was funny because when we were picking the name of the podcast, I remember I was talking to some of the business folks, and I was like, we should call it something like this, Adventures of Alice and Bob, or I can't remember what the first plays on they were, and they were like, nobody's gonna know what that means, and I'm like, yeah, but it's kind of the point of the show, and I think today had a lot of that, right? Where there was a lot of things we mentioned that are worth Googling in of themselves to go learn about more, in the same way that, obviously the old crypto references with Alice and Bob and everything else are fun to know. That there's a whole bunch of rabbit holes is the only way I'd put it. So I'll be sure to tell the folks when they post this one that this is one that people should do with Google, and just learning about some of the kind of like other folks and the names that you mentioned, and the history, right, and the kind of through line to what we all think of as the kind of security industry and everything else today has been a fascinating story. So really appreciate you sharing some of your part of it, man, and it was great to be chatting with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure. And by the way, when you do release this episode, you might even have to drop like a blog post or something and start linking, to textfiles.com and THC, the Hacker's Choice, and Cult of Dead Cow. You got to.
We'll put. I mean, I think you threw in there. I think you put in there. You mentioned earlier the Hacker's Manifesto. I mean, that alone is a fun read from back in the day. And yeah, man. Tell me this. Now we're just kind of riffing at the end. I don't know where Ben's going to edit us or not, but I was messing with one of the Apple Vision Pros, and like I don't know, dude, but all the people that were talking about flying through 3D file systems and Hackers Movie and making fun of it, I'm like, it's all here now.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And the same people that were saying that stuff about hackers are the same people enjoying the hell out of this augmented reality situation. Now they have terminals flying around. They're like this. But what happened when hackers came? You guys were very vocal about that. Oh, you know what? Someone needs to make an Apple Vision app that recreates the hacking scene when they're breaking into the Gibson, bro. Come on. You know what I'm talking about? They have to remake that.
Let's see that. I would buy that app in a heartbeat, dude.
Ooh, so whoever's listening to app developer, recreate that scene when they break into the Gibson. You have 2 buyers. I'll buy it.
Done. Dude, great way to end it, man. Again, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for jumping on.
Cheers, man. It's been a pleasure.